Welcome everybody, this is the SharePoint Patterns and Practices webcast, and this time we're talking about the CRUD operations with SharePoint Framework client-side web parts. And just to clarify what the CRUD actually means, because well, some of us might know, some of us might not know, it means create, read, update and delete operations in this context. And the whole point of this webcast is actually to demonstrate you a tutorial sample which we have within the SharePoint GitHub organization in the SPFX web parts repo, which is the most simplistic code example to show these CRUD operations using different techniques. So using different JavaScript libraries and also without a library. And the whole point of these tutorials is to help people to adapt the right way of doing these operations depending on the library what you're using. My name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a senior program manager from a SharePoint engineering side, and with me within the webcast is Waldek Mastergaard. Waldek will do the intro.
Yes, hi everybody. My name is Waldek Mastergaard. I am Office Development MVP, work as senior developer at Core, and today I'll be your JavaScript dude.
It's excellent. Thank you, Waldek. So Waldek is going to do the demo. We will have a chat and discussions around the webcast like typically. Before we go to the actual content, just a quick reminder. There's always new people watching this video, so HTTP, AKMS, SPPnP, or SharePoint PnP, either way. You'll land to the PnP landing page, and from there you can find code samples, guidance documentations, a lot of additional insights, videos and all of that stuff around the PnP. SharePoint PnP is for getting started. It's for helping you to understand how to do stuff in the SharePoint adding model, but also how to do stuff in the future SharePoint framework capabilities. But I think that's it for the introduction. So let's actually move into the context of today's webcast. So, like mentioned, we want to show you how to do simplistic, how to do CRUD operations using as simplistic examples as possible. And these are really meant to be as stepping stones. So, if you have, for example, previous knowledge about Angular, this will help you to understand how to get your the basic operations included in the SharePoint framework. Or if you have a previous knowledge on React, or you want to learn how to use React, these samples will show how to do the basic operations towards SharePoint list from your client-side web part. We have 4 different web parts in the solution. One of them is not using any framework, so it's essentially using the native SharePoint framework capabilities. One of them is using Angular, one of them is using React, and the 4th one is using the PnP JavaScript Core component, which is, by the way, JavaScript Core library, I would say, which is, by the way, a super interesting library as well, helping you on accessing the SharePoint data using kind of a fluent API model. And we're going to show all of this in practice within the demo. So let's actually jump on the demo. Demos are always nice, and we can actually see the code, what's being done. So let's switch to Waldek, and Waldek is going to lead the demo, and we're going to go through this individual web parts and explain let's say, the key considerations between all of them. So Waldek, take it away.
All right. So today we would like to show you the sample that we've built that illustrates how you can perform SharePoint CRUD operations in React, Angular, using no JavaScript framework at all, or the new PnP JS library. So the solution that we have contains 4 web parts, and each one of them illustrates another framework. And they all work exactly the same. So here I have the one that's built in React, but for example, if I click plus to add another one and I would pick the one in Angular, it looks exactly the same, right? So let's just walk through one of them. We will see how it works, what it does, and then we will go to the code and we'll step by step through the different things that you have to take into account to implement CRUD across these frameworks.
One thing what I want to quickly just jump in on this one, obviously the UI design here, we intentionally wanted to keep it as simple as possible. So this is really for showing the getting started and steps for people using this framework and accessing the data from a SharePoint context. So do not concentrate on the UI design, even though, Waldek, you've done an awesome job on designing.
Thank you. Well, so I actually wanted to ask, you wouldn't deploy that in production?
Yes,
I would actually put that on the front page of my intranet to be able to create and read items. There you go.
There we go. Yeah.
All right, let's get rid of the Angular web part for now, and let's see how the React web part works. So the first thing that we have to do when we add the web part to the page, and that is exactly the same for any of them, is if you go to settings, you have to specify the name of your list, right? So that can be just any list in your site, and just enter its name so that the web part knows where to get the items from and where to update them and manage them. So with that, we can do the first thing and create an item. So here you will see that it will create new item, and it's done, and it will show its title and ID. So then we can read the info from this item. And then we can see that confirm that the last item that we added is the item with ID, in this case 65, and with the current date. Then we can also read all items in a list and then show them in a list. Another thing that we can do is update the last item that we created. So it will just update its title, which also includes the current date and time. So with that, if we read again, we can see that our items is 65 has now modified date. And then finally, as the last step, we can remove the item from the list. So now we are deleting the item with ID 65, and we confirm that yes, we want to get rid of it. And then when we get all the items from the list, we can see that item 65 is not among them anymore. So that's just a simple CRUD overview operations, and you will see exactly the same UI, UX even, across all web parts that we have. So React, Angular, no framework at all, and then the PnP JS Core.
And one comment on this one. So really, when you think of it, when we work with SharePoint and SharePoint list data, it's just a combination of all of these operations, isn't it? So you're accessing the information from a list, you're creating items in a list, or you are deleting or updating items in a list. And that's really the whole purpose of this tutorial or those samples, is to give you that, let's say, the building blocks and understanding how would I actually do them in that particular library. So simplistic, no doubt, but it's there for people to adapt the right ways of doing or operating against SharePoint.
Absolutely, and if you wait a moment, you will see that there are actually quite a few things that you should take into account in order to do it correctly, right? Because there are a few things that you might not think of or get. So with this sample, you will get easy code to follow, to read through, and you could even implement it as is, just to be sure that you don't miss anything, that you have everything in place to do it the right way. So with that, let me switch to code. And here is the project that will be soon available to you as well. So all of the source that you see here, you will be able to go through as well, and you will have exactly the same source, right? So you will it will be available on GitHub, and when you grab the source, build or add dependencies, and build the project, you will see exactly the same. So here you see the 4 web parts that we have. So we have one in Angular, one without any particular framework, one in React, and one that leverages the PnP JS Core library. So let's start in React. If you know React,
or in this case Angular, you open up the Angular web part. Just
yeah. So if you know React, Angular is way different.
Yes.
That was what I was trying to say. No. Yeah.
Good save.
Yes. So if you know Angular, you will see that most of those parts are familiar. There are 1 or 2 things that you have to take into account, but other than that, it's just REST operations against the SharePoint REST API. Right? So here is the web part, and from the web part we define template, and here we actually bootstrap our application. And our Angular app consists of the module, which is really simple in this case. We have one controller and one service that actually performs the CRUD operations. So in our service, if we go here, we have operations for creating an item, reading an item, getting the latest item ID, which we need for the simplistic operations to read, update, and delete an item. Because if you look back at the UI, we don't have any entry field or choice list to pick an item. So the way we worked around it to keep it really simple is to get the last item from the list and operate on that, right? And if there is none, you will get an error, right? So here you can, for example, see how we do that. So whenever we want to create an item in a list, there are actually quite a few things that you have to take into account, right? So first, you have to get the list item entity type name, right? So let me show you how it works. If I open the developer tools and I will click create item, let me actually refresh the page because that information here is already cached. But if I create an item, you will see actually that the first call here is the call to the list to get its list item entity type full name. And that's the type, which is in this case sp.data.todo list item, is a string that's basically built from the name of your list, and then to it you have to prepend sp.data. And then you have to append list item. And there are quite a few things that you have to take into account for the name of your list, because that's not the name of your list as is. There are some rules that apply to it, like it has to be capitalized, it has to be, if there is a space in the name of your list, it has to be removed and all of that. So while you could do it by yourself, it's just easier here to request it using the API, right? So that's the first call that we do. We request that type from the list, and you will get the exact string the way it's need to be from SharePoint, right? Another thing that we have to do before we can add an item is we have to get the request digest token, which is the guy here, which is the token here. And that's basically a way to enforce security that you're not hijacking requests and you are actually on the page. You have a valid a request, right? So and you need that for any post operation. So forget you don't need that, but for any post like create new item, update an item, delete an item, you need this token. So that's another call that we have to do in Angular by ourselves to get the token first, and then finally using both the token and the list item entity type full name, we construct our payload for creating an item. So here are the response headers, request headers, and here is actually payload that we create. So that's the underscore metadata type where we specify the list item entity type full name and then title of our item. And we do all of that in code. So here first we do an post or get request using REST to get the list item entity type name. So that request is here. And that's just a call to underscore API, which is the SharePoint REST API, web lists. We get the list, and then from the list, we only want to have this one property, right? We don't want to get the whole list. Once we have that, then we get the request digest, which is the token that we need in order to be able to issue a post request. And then finally, with these two in place, we are able to construct the post request to create the item in a list. And as you can see, we have to create the body ourselves, right? Because in Angular, we use the Angular itself, the Angular's own HTTP service that allows us to test Angular apps and to actually use the dependency injection that we have in Angular. But the downside is that it doesn't do anything for us, right? So when we will talk about React and no JS framework at all and the PnP, you will see that they make it a bit easier, right? Because they do some things for us. But here in this case, we have to do all of that by ourselves, right? One thing that you might have seen is that the request that we issue, we actually we set the accept header to application/JSON OData no metadata. And the reason we do that is to optimize the payload that we get from the API. So in other words, what we say is the only thing that we want to get is exactly the thing we request. So we don't want to get any OData, metadata. We don't want to get anything else, just the basic information that we asked for. And that way, you can optimize the data that goes over the wire, right? So the less bytes go over the wire, the faster your app will work. Another thing that you can see here on the screen is that in order to create an item, we have to actually issue a few requests, right? So there's one for the list item entity type name, there's one for request digest, there's one for actually the creation of the item, and one way to do that would be to use callbacks, right? So you would just nest function in function in function, and when one function is done, you would call another. With 3 requests, it would be already complex to read. If you can imagine, some operations take actually more calls. So that would make your code really hard to follow and read. And an easier way to work around it is to use promises. Which in this case we use promises that are available in Angular, and then in other webparts that we have, we will use the ECMAScript 6 promises shim that's available together with framework. Either way, no matter which promises type you use, the basic principle is exactly the same. You chain promises in a flat list. So you say, issue this synchronous operations. When it's done, do this. And then when that's done, do this. And then do this. So that way you can have a really flat list of your code, because you can see that all of these operations are just in one level. It's just one chain of asynchronous operations that fire one after another. Right? So that way you can really easily, or you can simplify your code and yet have exactly the same serial approach to a number of asynchronous operations that follow each other. One thing with that you have to take into account, what do you do if one of these operations breaks? So for example, you would try to read an item when it's not in a list, or you would like to access a list and the list isn't there. Right? So you wouldn't be able to complete the whole chain, right? So imagine that somewhere in the chain there is an error, you would like to handle it. And when you chain promises, the thing is that even though each promise, so each then clause, could have its own error handling, if you would do that, you would actually handle the error of that clause, but the chain would actually go on. Right? So you wouldn't stop the chain, because each chain is a function. So if you stop doing operations in a then clause, then you only break out of that function, but you don't break out of the whole chain. So one way to work around it, to solve this issue, is to only handle your error once at the end. In the less than clause, you specify your operation, and only then you specify error. And the way this works, and it works exactly the same in Angular and in ES6 promises, is that if any of these promises fails, but if there is no error handler, it will actually break out of the chain until it finds one. So it will skip all other then operations in the chain until it finds an error handler, and only then they will stop. And because that is in our last clause, then our chain finishes. Right? So that's a really easy way, convenient way for you to break the whole chain of asynchronous operations just in one place. All right. So that's how you can create new items and get additional info from the list, in order to be able to issue post requests in REST. Another thing that's interesting to see, for example, is that whenever you want to update an item, the way it works is you get an item from the list, you change it, and then you update it. But how can you be sure that the item hasn't changed between the time you got it and you edited it, right? And with REST, one way we could do that is to leverage the E tag. So think of E tag as a property of your item, similar to a version number. When you get an item from SharePoint using REST API, you will get also one of the things that you will get is the E tag. And E tag basically says this item is now version 1. When you work with your item and update it, and then when you issue a post request to update it, so this is how we do it, we say the method of request is post, but here we say the XHTTP method is merge. So merge says do not override the whole item, only update the fields that I specify. So as you know, an item in a list has properties like title, ID, author, modified, and all of that. But here we only set new title. So we don't want to erase everything else. We only want to change this one field. So we do that by saying here XHTTP method is merge. And then what we can do additionally to ensure that the item that we are about to update is still exactly the same item that we got initially is to add the header of if-match and to specify our E tag. And the way it works is that if the E tag of the item on the server will match this request, it will update. Otherwise, it will fail. It will fail saying that the item has changed since the last time you got it, and you cannot update it because you have all the info, right? And the one way to work around it, if you wouldn't do it, so if you would either omit the whole header or you would here say an asterisk, so you would do this, that basically means override. So no matter if your item is still the same or if it's changed, you would override what's there. And personally, I'd say it's a bad approach because the data that you are working with is not integral anymore.
Yeah, you never know how important data you would be overriding. So
exactly. So you should always include the E tag, and there are differences in how you get it, right? For example, in Angular, you can get it from the headers. Which is, can we see it somewhere here? I'm trying to figure out if we got it somewhere. Yeah, we probably have it somewhere. Anyways, you can get it from the headers. For example, when we work with other approaches, you can get it from the OData metadata that's available within the request. And we will see that approach when we work with the SPPNP library, right? And working with the E tag applies to both update and delete of an item. So if we go, for example, to a delete operation, you'll see exactly the same that here we set the XHTTP method to delete. The request type is still post, but the if match tag is item E tag, right? So we still set E tag here. So we say that we only want to get rid of the item if the item in the list is exactly the same item that we have, right? Yes, and with that actually wraps the part in the service. Another interesting thing is that, for example, when you see here, is that we pass every single time on every call, we pass the web URL and name of the list around. So why couldn't we, for example, inject it here once? Well, it has to do with the thing that your application, when it's used in a web part, is bootstrapped only once. So that means you'll have only one instance of this data service. And if you would inject it here, you wouldn't be able to update it. So if, for example, someone would add the web part to the page, set to work it with one list, and then would change the name of the list afterwards, you actually would not be able to push that new name of the list all the way down here. So the way we work around that is, because if you think about it, we set properties on the web part in the web part itself, but we actually need the values all the way down in Angular, right? And our Angular app doesn't really know that it actually works inside a web part. So how do we pass the values that users can set in browser in web part all the way down to Angular? And one approach to do that is to issue an event on the root scope. So that way we do that in the render function here, and the render function runs every single time someone would change something in web part. So if you would go back to web part and we would change something here to the 1, there is render. If we remove that, the web part will be rendered. So basically, on every property change, the render function runs. And what we do then is we issue an event here, and we pass to do that event the new name of our list. Then in Angular, in our controller, we actually subscribe to that event, and then every time it occurred, we re-init our application. So we actually set new URL, new list name, and we reset the data that we got. And based on that, in our services, we always have access to the latest URL of the site and the name of the list, right? Because we pass them using the event from the web part to our controller, and then on every call here, we actually pass them the URL of the site and the name of the list. We actually pass that to our service, right? So we don't depend on the singleton instance of our service that we have injected here. All right, so that concludes Angular part. Let's move, for example, to React. So in React, we have exactly the same approach. We have exactly the same UI and UX. The only difference is that where in Angular we use the Angular's own HTTP service, here in Angular we use the HTTP client that we have available from the web part. And already there, the first challenge arises. Okay, so the web part is where the HTTP client is available, but actually all of the operations are performed in our React CRUD component, which we instantiate within the web part. So how do we get the client over from the web part into our component? One way to work around that is to pass it as properties. So here in our component, if we go all the way up, we actually specified that the client, the HTTP client that we use to issue REST operations, is actually passed or should be passed as one of the properties along with the URL of the site. And then we inherit the name of the list from the properties of the web part that we have here, right? Because our components properties extend all properties that we have within the web part. So here we have already list name, and then on top of that we define the HTTP client and site URL. And if we would, for example, compare the operations of creating an item, we have exactly the same approach. So we still need to get the list item entity type name ourselves. But the one thing that we don't need to do is we don't need to get the request IDs ourselves, because the HTTP client does that for us. So even though there are still things, and actually here I see, oh yeah, here you can see the hack approach to the code, right? So this is what you could do initially if you wanted to do it by yourself, which might work or might not work, whereas better approach would be to actually use the name as here, right? So in a code that you will get, you will see that all of the body actually makes use of this string here, the type that we get from the list, and not the one that we try to build ourselves. And even though the HTTP client that we get from the web part does some work for us, like to get the request digest, we still have to get, for example, things like name. We still have to build the body ourselves, and we still have to post all of that to SharePoint. One thing that you have to take into account there is that by default, the HTTP client uses the header of OData version 4. And if you keep that, it will break. You won't be able to call the API. You will get an error. So one way to work around it for a time being now is actually to add it to empty. So that way the REST API will work. Other than that, it's just exactly the same approach for every item. You still see exactly the same item, and you can see exactly the same way we chain promises, even though here we actually work with promises with the ECMAScript 6 shim promises, right? So they are not exactly the same. And one difference, for example, here is that what you get back from the HTTP client is a response. And in order, for example, to get JSON, that's another promise. So that's not a synchronous operation. Right, so we have to have this additional step from which we actually get the JSON output from the response that we got initially. With that, let's move to the no framework approach that we have here, and that just uses exactly the same HTTP client that we use in React. The only difference is that we do everything within the web part. So we have no additional class, components, or any of that. We do all of the operations directly within the web part. So we can just use all of the operation or all of the info like list name, URL of the site, HTTP client directly from within the web part, because all of that info is available to us here. So here you can see that we call directly this context HTTP client get. We get the URL of the web from the page context info that we have available, and we get the name of the list directly from web part from properties, because we are directly in the list. And the one more thing that I wanted to show you is how you would, for example, perform CRUD operations using the SharePoint PnP JavaScript library. So that's a new library that's being in development. Currently, if I recall that correctly, we are in version 1.0.4, yes, which works surprisingly well. So for example, let me display that side by side. So on the right-hand side, we will see the same operation if we didn't use any framework at all. And for comparison, let's use update, which I hope, well, doesn't really even fit on a screen. There you go. There's so much stuff going on there that it doesn't really even fit on a screen. And then on the left-hand side, let's actually show exactly the same operation using the SharePoint PnP JS library. So update item is here, and it still doesn't. Well, it fits on a screen exactly.
Fits on a screen, yeah.
It just fits on a screen. So for example, here on the right-hand side, the first thing that we have to get is the list item entity type name. So that's the type name that we have to include within the body, right? Which is all the way down here. If you look at the SPPnP library approach, we don't need to do that because that library does that for us by itself, right? So the only thing that we have to do then is to get the ID of the item that we have to update. Well, we have to do that because that's our own logic, right? So we chose ourselves not to store the ID of the latest item we added to the list, but to actually get it from the list directly. Right? And here, for example, to do that, with raw REST, we had to build the whole URL of API web list, get the list items, get the list ID. Oh, actually, so we have to actually have it implemented here. Let's compare that, which is the one here. So we get all items, then we order them descending by ID with top one, and we only want to select the ID, right? With SPPNP, you can do it in a more fluent and less prone approach because it's just objects. So think a bit like link. We say return PnP SP web lists. From list, we want to get one by title, which is this property list name. From there, we want to have items. We want to get, actually, let's compare exactly the same headers. So that's the one here. So here, yeah, you can see the function is half as long. So here we have the PnP SP web list, get list. We want to get all items. We order them by ID descending, and we get top one, select an ID. So the only strings here are the name of the fields by which we sort and which we want to get. Whereas here, the whole URL, and imagine you can make a typo in any of this, not to mention these quotes and all of that. So that's just way easier, not to mention it saves you a lot of typing, right? Because on this, if you would make a typo, you would get directly an error because that object doesn't exist. Whereas here, it's just a URL, it's just a string, right? So it's way more error prone to do it manually than to use the SPPNP JS library. Going back to our update, which is here and which is here. So once we have the update, we want to update it. So here we need to do additional step, right? We need to get the item to get the E tag. And for here, we actually get the item again. That's the way it is done. But for example, one of the things that you don't have in the PnP library is access to headers. So whenever you issue a REST call and you get a response, there is no way, or at least not that I know of, to get the headers from response, where, for example, the E tag is. So here you can see that in the raw approach, we can just get response headers get, right? And from there, we get E tag. In PnP, you get directly an item. So you don't have the response. So one way to work around it is to override the set of metadata that you get back to actually increase it, and then get the E tag from the OData metadata that you get along with the items. And another thing worth noting is that where in the raw approach on every single request we have to say accept no metadata, so to say to actually optimize the response that we get. In PnP you can do it once. So here all the way in constructor you can just say PnP setup headers to this. And with this approach, every single request that you issue will have this header added, and you can specify there whatever you want, right? So all of that will be added to every single call you make, so that you don't have to do it every single time over and over again, which simplifies building your code and makes it more consistent, right? So that's another thing that you get, and based on that we can get E tag that we then pass in our update. So for example, here where we do an update, in the raw approach, we have to, once again, build the body ourselves, build the URL, set the headers, pass E tag, whereas here in PnP, it's just one line of code. You get the list, you get items, you get the item, and you say update, and then you pass E tag. And that's it. So you can really easily see how much easier it is to actually use PnP library and its Fluent API than to build all of the requests by yourselves, right? And the library is still new, so there is still a chance that not operations might be there. The great thing is it's open source. So if there is a bug or there are features that are not there, please help out, submit PR, and it's really easy. And then you will see that not only you but everyone else will be able to benefit of this approach and not build REST requests by themselves. So I guess that concludes the demo. How about we go back to slides and we recap it?
Yep, let's recap the demo and covered materials and wrap up the webcast. Thank you, Waldek, for this one.
Yep. All right. So as you have seen, we perform SharePoint CRUD operations using Angular, React, no framework at all, and the new SharePoint PnP JS library. The thing is that no matter which framework you use, you will be always able to communicate with SharePoint using REST. And it's up to you to choose whether you want to use the client that's available within the web part, whether you want to use the PnP JS library, or whether you love to go through the additional mile and build all of the raw REST requests yourself. Right?
That's actually a good point, Waldek. You can absolutely mix and match these libraries as well, because you can use the PnP JS library within the React component, even though the UI is using React, but you use the PnP JS library for the REST operations. Good point.
Yeah, and then interesting thing is that, for example, for React, there is the Office UI Fabric React project that makes it really easy to implement the Office UI Fabric UX within the web parts. Similarly, in Angular, there's a community initiative called NG Office UI Fabric, which is again an open source project that implemented Office UI Fabric as directives for Angular V1. So with that, if you like to work in Angular, it's really easy for you to build web parts that look the same way as the rest of SharePoint and Office.
And that's, so with that, I would even go to the level of saying that well, I wouldn't say that that's a best practice, because I hate the term best practice. But no doubt we want people to actually use the Office UI Fabric. It is there for consistency perspective. We within Microsoft and engineering are using that to render all of our components. So we would like to have the client-side web parts customizations also using that. So there's a consistency from a UI perspective.
Absolutely. So with that, we would encourage you to get the sample, give it a try, give it a go. And if there is anything else that you would like to see or know, let us know.
Sounds good. I think, yeah, we're not going to actually go every single one of the statements in the slide through, because that would take ages as well. But I think that wraps up the webcast. So the code itself is available. It will be mentioned in the video location where you're watching the video in the YouTube channel. And it will be available in the GitHub SharePoint organization underneath the web part repo. And if there's any questions, don't hesitate to contact us, and using the different forums and channels around giving us feedback, issues, comments related on samples and related on SharePoint Framework. But I think that's it. Thank you, Waldek, for a great demo. And I think this will be a highly beneficial tutorial for a lot of the people, because we know that there's a lot of people who are not super familiar on the client-side development techniques if they're coming from a classic SharePoint development side. But I think good stuff. So thank you for watching, and thank you, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Thank you.